Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 12th talk in this Only One Theme talk series, which is focused around innovation management. This series is hosted by our TechX.in vertical at Venture Center. The talk topic for today is on grant writing, and our speaker for today is Dr. Priya Nagraj. Let me briefly introduce Priya. Priya is the CEO of Pune Knowledge Cluster. She has over 10 years of work experience in the biopharma industry. In addition to this, she has worked extensively in the Indian startup and incubation ecosystem, where she has been a part of the Venture Center team for about 4 years, where she was leading our bio incubation efforts. Priya has mentored several early stage innovation-driven startups on de-risking technology, building a business, storytelling, grant writing, pitching, and raising funds. She holds a bachelor's and master's degree in microbiology and biochemistry. Her bachelor's is from Mumbai University, whereas her master's is from MS University, Baroda. She also has a PhD in cell biology from the University of Virginia, US. With this brief introduction, welcome Priya to the session and over to you.
Thanks, Mugdha. Good evening, everyone. And before I begin, I would like to thank the Venture Center team for inviting me to do this session. I must admit that a lot of what I have learned about grant writing and helping others, especially entrepreneurs with grant writing, is something that I did learn during my tenure at Venture Center. So I'm very thankful to the team and also to Dr. Premnath, and it's happy to be in some way back to where a lot of this work actually began. I would like to share my screen. Just give me a second. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it, Priya.
All right. Please feel free to type your questions in the chat box as we go along, because this is, I don't want it to sort of be a monologue as much as possible. And I will keep looking at the chat box as I speak to see whether I can take questions and also take it in the context of the talk itself, wherever applicable. All right, so as part of the talk today, I think I will go over a few basics about grant writing, some best practices, and also take the example of one particular grant application and do sort of a walkthrough in terms of do's and don'ts. And then, of course, we will have question and answers. To begin with, I would like to start with a very common question that entrepreneurs have, which is, what is the difference between pitching for a grant and an investment? We will start with what is common first. I think in both cases, you are asking for funds to perform certain activities and to also achieve certain deliverables within a defined period of time. Also, both of them, whether you're writing for a grant or asking money from an investor, ask for a plan. They want to know what is it that you're going to do with the money. And both of them require a very strong storyline and data to sort of substantiate your storyline or your claims. And we will talk more about that. There is strong emphasis on the team that is going to deliver on the project or on the grant, and also timelines. That means the amount of time that it would actually take for you to maybe start this process and maybe actually get the funds in, would be about 8 to 10 months. A lot of people seem to think that investments are faster, but that's not true. I think more or less probably takes the same amount of time. If you were to see what the differences are, I think in the case of grants, ideally grants are money where they don't expect anything in return. The funding body understands that they're funding, something that involves taking risk where the chances of failure is also high, which means that they don't expect something in return. In the case of investments, generally, there is an expectation that there is a stake in the company. So whoever is giving money to the organization is expecting something in return. A very, very important difference is between a grant and an investment is that a grant tends to fund a specific project within the company. And we will talk about how you can design a project based on your product development plan for your company. And a grant may not be interested in everything you're doing as a company. So you may be doing other things, you may be developing multiple products, you may be offering services in the company, but a grant funding body may not be interested in that. But for an investor, it's possible that they will be interested in everything you do as a company. Grants also tend to predominantly fund technology de-risking. That means you are trying to get your technology to a stage where you can now confidently say that your technology has probably less chances of it failing in an actual scenario, in a real life scenario. But investors tend to like to fund scaling. They tend to like to fund traction, go-to-market strategy. So that comes maybe at a slightly later stage, once you have reached later stages of technology de-risking. And we will talk about what TRLs and technology de-risking mean. Grants may or may not fund manpower. Depending on the type of the grant, you may get money to fund manpower. In some cases you don't, and funds may be capped under specific heads. In the case of investments, that necessarily won't be true, and you may get funds. You will most likely get funds to fund a manpower in the company. A grant generally does not like to fund a pure service-based business where there is no innovation, where there is no product that actually does get developed, but an investment firm would be interested in funding a service-based business. Grants tend to look for novelty, innovation. Investments tend to look for large enough opportunities. They do look for a differentiation, or they do look for an edge that you have to offer as compared to your competitors. But a grant would be more interested in understanding what is the novelty or innovation in the product. Grants are willing to bear product innovation risk. Investments may be more interested in bearing a business innovation risk that may come in maybe once your product is at a later stage and ready to hit market. These are some of the questions that I have encountered in working with startups that I get when it comes to grants. One is, why should I apply for a grant? More so often, grants tend to fund you when no one else wants to fund you. That probably has to do with the stage at which your technology is at, the amount of risk associated with the failure of your technology if things do fail. Let's assume that you do apply for a grant and it's your first time or your second time, and your application doesn't go through. Even if you don't get the grant, you've actually gone through a very rigorous review and assessment process, which teaches you a lot about how your pitch is, how others perceive your grant storyline, and what do they really think about your product and your product idea. So having that feedback, in many cases free of cost, because you get your grant application reviewed by so many reputed advisors, experts in the space, both technical as well as mentors, and many of them will be nationwide. It's not local. I think that kind of an opportunity is very unique. Also, the experience of pitching. I mean, the idea that the more you apply for funding, the chances that you will get selected to go and pitch in front of a jury, and that itself is an opportunity for you to get feedback on your pitching, your storyline, and the project itself. And credibility. I mean, if and when you do get the grant itself offers a lot of credibility to say that you have got this grant. And my understanding is that a lot of investors also try and ask whether you have in fact pitched and won certain maybe prestigious grants that are available today in the country, because they feel that somebody else has validated your product idea. Process takes up to 9 months. There is no guarantee that you will get funded. So do I stop all my work and wait for the grant to come? Well, the answer is no. I think it is important to plan, understanding that you are looking at an 8 to 10 month timeline from the start of application till the end. And again, there is no guarantee that you will get the grant, but then do plan well ahead. And assuming that you're not putting all your eggs in one basket, you do have other options to fund your company. And you do have other options in terms of grants. That means you're not applying for one grant and waiting for that to come through. Puts you in a position where when you do finally get selected for grants, it's possible that you may get selected for 1 or 2 or 3 of them, and you have the opportunity to pick which one you want to go ahead with. I haven't formed a company yet. Are there grants that fund individuals? Yes, there are grants that do fund individuals at an early stage. And I think Venture Center will be very happy to tell you about what those opportunities are. Grants don't seem to exactly match my requirements and what I want to do. Do I need to deviate from what I'm doing just to get a grant? Now, this is a very common question, because when you look at a grant, application, they will put certain conditions down, in many cases fairly broadly, saying that they're willing to fund certain domains, certain TRL levels within that domain, or certain types of ideas within that domain. And it's possible that you may not have a perfect fit when it comes to that area, but then it is likely that no grant is going to be tailor-made for your use. So I think it's important for you to know how to leverage grants to suit them to what is it that you're doing, rather than sort of thinking about this vice versa. Process of filling a grant application takes time. It does. And I think which is why a lot of the grant applications, at least the ones that are announced nationally, do give you about 90 days to make that or to fill that application, where you can of course download it, go through it, think about what is it that you want to write, and it gives you enough time to go through a few iterations, get advice and pitch. So do start planning ahead. And also it's nice to have a streamlined process within your company so that you can work on many grants without actually reworking your application too much. And we'll talk about that too. The grant amount is not enough to do everything that you want to do in the company. That's probably true, because the idea of a grant is also not to fund everything that you have to do in the company. It is to fund a specific project or a specific leg within a project. And it's important for you to account for that, saying that these are activities I can do within this grant, but there are other activities that you will need to look for other sources of funding for, and always make sure that you're actively doing that. Also, how much funds can I realistically get from grants? Based on my experience, I think depending on the sector you are and depending on the funding opportunities that exist today, I would say from anywhere between 10 lakhs to about 5 crores could be a grant funding that you can raise. All right. So coming to best practices, this is just a cartoon that I would like to start with to give you an idea of how you can think about breaking up your product development plan to, sort of projectize it to apply for a grant. So say you have a plan in place to develop a minimal viable product, and I have divided that plan into 4 phases, assuming that each phase has a goal or each phase has a deliverable, saying that if I have completed phase 1, I know I have completed phase 1 because I have met certain deliverables. Now I have maybe followed step 1, 2, 3 to achieve phase 1, and say step 1, 2, 3 to achieve phase 2, right? So if you were to break down your product development plan into something like this, then you can think about, what a specific goal for a phase is. That means what will you achieve at the end of each phase? What would be the steps involved to achieve that goal? What would be the timelines, the budget, the manpower, and maybe other specialized requirements, and what kind of external assistance you need depending on the phase you're at. So if I have to sort of put up some timelines to this and some funding amounts to this, if I have to say that for me to do step 1, I need about 5 lakhs and I need about 3 months. For step 2, another 5 lakhs, about 6 months. For step 3, about 30 lakhs, another 3 months. And then if I have to projectize this and say that, okay, I can maybe use a grant for 5 lakhs to achieve step 1. I can use another grant to achieve maybe 10 lakhs worth of funding. If I get 10 lakhs worth of funding, I can do step 1 and step 2, and in a period of about, say, 18 months. And if I get something like 50 lakhs, then I can apply for a grant like BIG. I can use that to offer a bigger deliverable for the amount of money that I'm asking for. So as you can see that just within one phase, you have the option to break up your project into different, into different sub-phases. And you can request for different funding amounts. You can apply to different grants based on the timelines and what the grant has to offer. So in many ways, you are also sort of adjusting your product development plan to what the grant is asking you to do, but you are also meeting the deliverables for your phase, as expected, as you would want to do in your company. And do note that your deliverables for if you have different projects going on in the company, your deliverables for your project 1 and 2 are different. So you would ideally have a chart like this for every project, every product that you would develop in the company. So this is what it would look like, for example, for two products. Like your product 2 might be at phase 1, your product 1 might be at phase 3. You may have advanced more in that chart. And so you may be looking at applying for a different grant, which lets you do maybe scale up activities or manufacturing activities, which is what you may be requiring money for in phase 3 for product 1, versus what you need as to build proof of concept or demonstrate a prototype for your first phase. Now, if I have to contextualize this into what is called as technology readiness levels, which essentially classifies your technology based on the stage at which your technology is at, you can look at each phase as one TRL. So if TRL1 is your phase 1, you may have a certain number of steps to achieve deliverables at TRL level 1. Similarly, at 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. And those of you who do not know what a TRL level is, a chart like this helps you broadly at least understand that if you are developing a technology-based product, you are looking at a gradual process of de-risking your technology, where you start with an idea, you do some proof of concept studies, you then go on to developing a prototype, and you take that prototype into as close as a real setting as possible. And then you validate it again in as close as a real setting as possible before you reach production in a real scenario. And a lot of your ancillary support, which is IP and your regulatory and approvals and certifications, would fall along this chart at some phase or the other, depending on what the requirement of the product is. I mean, ideally, for a lot of the highly regulated products, you do have very well-defined TRL charts. So if you were looking at the automobile space or the drug development space or the aerospace, you have very well-defined TRLs. But there are products where, for example, if you're developing an agricultural product and things like that, where those are not very defined, you do have reference charts that you can look at and broadly classify your product into a TRL level. You will also, in many cases, it's always nice for you to define where you stand on a TRL chart for yourself. And then, of course, validate it with maybe other products that are in market to see whether, you have sort of equivalence in terms of what you have defined as TRLs. If you do look at, so there is something also called it as market readiness level, but for the purpose of this talk, I'll stick to TRLs. But then it's important for you to know that your investors will expect your TRL levels to be as high as possible. I think because they would then like to understand what your market risks are. Because they would then know that your technology is sufficiently de-risked. So they would like for you to raise grant funding to de-risk technology as much as possible. So certain basic do's and don'ts about, the process itself. These are very simple things, and I think we assume that everyone will do this, but then I think it's important for me to highlight do remember that you should read your guidelines or the scheme document of the grant. I know that those documents are very detailed, and sometimes in just the excitement of wanting to apply for the grant, a lot of people tend to skip or ignore reading those documents in detail, but please do. Because the document provides a lot of insight into whether you are eligible, whether it's worth all the hard work that you're going to put in. You should not end up spending a lot of time to only realize that, you were not eligible to apply in the first place. It also defines when the grant application is due, what are the expectations of deliverables, etc. And prepare in stages. Don't get overwhelmed trying to do everything at once. Every grant application generally goes through certain stages. They ask you for a written application, then they ask you to, if you get selected, to come and pitch. I've seen entrepreneurs trying to do the whole thing at once. Don't do that. Try and also develop your grant application in phases so that you don't get overwhelmed by, the preparation phase itself. Do your homework. Do find out what type of projects the grant funding has offered before. And if so, how different you are as compared to what they have funded before. I think now for a lot of the national grants, this information is available on their website. So I think it's easier for you to go look them up. And sometimes when you pitch for the grant, or sometimes in the application itself, they may ask, saying that, how are you different from other organizations which are in this space? And some of them may have been funded through the same grant. Please do check the grant deadline date as well as the time. A lot of grants these days tend to close applications at, in the middle of the day, like 5:30 p.m. or 6 p.m. during working hours and not at 12 a.m. And also try and submit 2 to 3 days before the deadline. Understand what the grant agency values, because it's possible that some of them will be looking for social impact. Some of them, it is important to them that the person making the application maybe is a woman. If the grant itself mandates that, or in the sense gives value for that. And also whether they're interested in global adoption or are looking at technologies which can be globally adopted. Understand the evaluation process, talk to previous grantees, read up to see, whether such a process has been described by the grant body itself. I'll just give you one example. If I have to condense all of this for the biotechnology ignition grant, this is what that would look like. You're looking at an eligibility criteria of an individual or a company. It tells you what the grant amount is, the duration, the evaluation stages. It also tells you about what the deadline for the program is. It's good to write this down somewhere so that if there is somebody else in your company also who is helping you prepare for this, they're aware. It also gives you a very detailed breakup of what the weightage for assessment is. So this is also, again, something that is important for you to see in advance so that you prepare for your application accordingly, and you can give that much weightage when you write your applications. It also talks about the broad domains that are supported under this. They also give you an idea of what they are willing to fund. Again, very important. Sometimes people do apply for a 50 lakh grant, but they ask for, say, 1 crore or they ask for 2 crores. While it is possible that that is maybe what is actually needed for your product development, for the purpose of this grant, what maybe BIG is interested in knowing is what is it that you can do effectively with 50 lakhs. So I think it's important for you to know what the breakup of that funding is, if that is shared. And it's good for you to stick to these breakups when you are asking for funding. And I think this is something that, again, something that I did learn during my time in Venture Center is the importance of a storyline. I think a storyline has to have some continuity in terms of, what is your narrative and what is it that you're trying to pitch for? Because eventually you're going to ask for money and you're going to tell them what you're asking the money for and what you're going to do with it. And I think whatever leads up to it has to be a coherent story. I know that a lot of people who come from technology backgrounds do say that if you state facts and if you state claims, with references and background, that sort of amounts to a story in its sense. In fact, a lot of those becomes pillars for your story. A story by itself can be substantiated by facts, but just by listing a bunch of facts down, you don't sort of build a narrative for the story. So essentially, story begins with an unmet need. If solved, will have enormous impact. Where does the solution lie? What people have tried, and what are you proposing to do, which will be different from what has been done in the past? And why are you the right person or the right team or the right company to do this? How is it that you're going to do it? And why do you believe this will be successful? How are you positioned to solve this problem? And your team, your milestones, how you're going to execute the project, what kind of resources will you need, and how do you plan to use these resources? And finally, your ask. Now, this doesn't differ significantly for an investment. You will be using a version of this for your investments, but you will also be using it for grants. Now, as a very early stage startup, it's possible that you don't have answers to all these questions. The idea to have a storyboard is that you do know that you don't have answers to all these questions and that you will be able to fill it along your journey or fill it along the way. But you will also understand that as you start collecting facts, you know where to plug in those facts. So as I said, your facts tend to substantiate the storyline that you're building. So you will know where to plug in those facts so that they become pillars to support the storyline that you're making. So if you have to start with a problem or a need, I think it's first of all important to define the problem that you are trying to address. Try and not be very generic about it. It's important to also say how you arrived at this need, and not say that this is something that you read somewhere or you saw somewhere that this is a problem. I think it's important to say what is it that you have done to arrive to really understand that this is a problem that you want to solve and that it indeed is a real problem. And please note that the proposed solution should address the need that you have actually identified. And there has to be a connection between what your problem is and the solution that you're talking about. And also to understand that while you're doing this, try and fit in or highlight shortcomings of available and current solutions in this itself. That means you're trying to say that, because that in many ways is part of the need. So while there might be an sort of unaddressed unmet need, and one of the reasons why it could be unmet or unaddressed is because there are solutions to that, but those solutions for some reason have not been able to address that problem effectively. All right. Now, remember, this is a very, very key part of your story, because your storyline begins here. Everything starts from how you are able to, sort of project or present the problem that you're solving. So if I were to look at, defining a product and then sort of understand how do I begin a storyline to pitch a product like this, or pitch for a grant to develop a product like this, right? The more specific I am about what is the product that I'm developing, I think it becomes easier for me to sort of understand how to build a storyline. So if I have to, for example, talk about my product as a diagnostic and monitoring device for diabetes versus a point of care diagnostic and monitoring device, versus a rapid point of care diagnostic and monitoring device versus a rapid point of care non-invasive diagnostic and monitoring device. So I think what I'm trying to say is that the more specific you are able to define your product, chances are that you will be able to think about, how do I tell a story about the need that I'm solving? Now, ideally, a need comes before you develop a solution. But then in many cases with startups which are developing technology, what we practically see is that they do start with, a technology. And they do then try and understand, what kind of an unmet need would a technology like this solve? Well, that at some point of time, you will sort of marry both. You will reach a situation where you will end up solving a problem that really needs to be solved. But then if you are stuck at a stage where you are applying for a grant for something that you have a proof of concept for, but you want to sort of understand what kind of a problem it would solve, it's still okay at that stage. I think you can, by defining your product very specifically, you will be able to, sort of define a story around it. So then you can think about where your story begins. So you can think about, are you going to start your story with so many million people in the world suffering from diabetes? Are you starting your story with how many people use a diagnostic device for diabetes at the home setting? Are you talking about a pain point for those people who do use that device, saying that they have to prick themselves to determine blood glucose levels, and that is the pain point, versus you are defining how many times they're doing that, what is the average age of a person, so how many times would they be doing that during their lifetime, to essentially bring out the severity of the problem. So it sort of brings you to the stage where you can define maybe a storyline which is more compelling for your product, depending on how specifically you define it, and also try and begin your story in such a way that, within about 3 steps, you reach an unmet need. So that's how crisp your storyline should eventually be, that with whatever figures, data, statistics that you're starting off with, the facts to substantiate your story, at some point, you should be able to arrive quickly at your unmet need. So this takes some practicing. You may have to go back and forth to get to this stage. It's always nice to give a very nice, sort of a visual representation of what your product is. I mean, ideally, you can write paragraphs about this, but there's nothing like showing a person what you have in mind for your product. Otherwise, it sort of becomes very difficult for the reviewer or anybody who's looking at your application to imagine what you have in mind. And that could also go the wrong way, because they may assume certain things about your product, which may not be true. So if you have a mock-up of your product, if you also have a reference image of your product without a logo, etc., and you don't have any copyrights infringing on that and all, I think it's a good idea to show how your product looks and how your product would be used. If you are working on a process and not a product, it's always a good idea to explain your process with a flow chart, compare it with a conventional or an existing process, and highlight where the value adds are for your process as compared to an existing process. And what you mean by a product is also something that it is better for you to define. In your head, it may be clear, but then when you put it down, do put it down explicitly. Are you talking about just a hardware, or a hardware and a software, or a service along with this, or a formulation in some cases, which could be liquid, which could be granules? You're making machineries with attachments, especially in the agriculture space, or are you developing a technology platform? And in many cases, for a grant application, they would like you to demonstrate at least one application area for that technology platform as a use case, and say that you have validated the platform for that. While you are not asking money for the whole thing, and I think that is probably made very clear in your grant application, it's important for the reviewer to know what you have in mind holistically as a product. So while it's okay to say that I'm not asking money for developing the hardware and software here, it is only for the hardware. But what I envision as my offering as a product is going to be eventually a hardware and a software. So it's good to highlight that. I think so all this while we spoke about product, we did not speak about the working of your product. We did not speak about the technology of your product. So first, do talk about product, talk about the value of that product to the customer. How will a customer use the product and what is the value for the customer in that product? And then talk about the technology behind the working or the workings of that product. And do not confuse this with the value. When you talk about technology, talk about the science behind your product, talk about how it works, disclose as much as you can. We hear this a lot from startups saying that if I talk about the workings of my product, will I be sharing confidential information and is that safe to do? I think there are ways to explain how your product works without sharing confidential information. And also, you should understand that you will be pitching to so many people. Some point, people will want to know how your product works, especially if there are people technically reviewing your application. So I think you should find a way to describe how your product works. And here it's important to highlight novelty. So I'm right now breaking this down into slides because it's visually easy for us to understand a representation on slides, but you may have to capture this in other forms in your grant application. So how does the product work? Use pictures, flowcharts, diagrams to describe this, and also describe, if there are underlying principles based on which the product works, do highlight what those principles are. Like, for example, if I'm developing a product for non-invasive detection of diabetes and I'm using infrared as the technology to do that, I do highlight that, yes, this is what I'm using to do it. It's, and you can always substantiate this with publications and other things to say that infrared has been used at least in the research setting, to detect blood glucose levels, and this is the correlation that has been seen, etc. So it's good to always highlight the principle behind the workings. Then, of course, a very clear case for novelty. That means you're trying to understand, whether there is IP potential for your product. This requires maybe for you to do a prior art search, for you to understand what has been filed before, for you to understand the claims, whether the claims that you're making are indeed novel, at least, as in your view. You may not have filed for a patent as yet. In some cases, if you have, do state what you have filed for, whether it's provisional, whether it's a complete patent, whether it's a design patent, etc. Do give some idea of what is it that you have filed for. Please note that novelty is not the same as a value proposition. That means talking about whether it is user-friendly and if it how it benefits the customer is not the same thing as highlighting what is non-obvious and what is novel about the product, which may be important for a patent application. So do keep these two things distinct. Also, when you talk about the when you apply for a grant, it's possible that you're applying for a grant somewhere in the middle of your product development process. So going back to one of the questions that I shared in my FAQ chart, which is, do I really stop and wait for a grant to come through to carry out my product development process? And the answer was obviously no, which means you are on a journey to develop a product, and somewhere along that journey, you are applying for a grant. So it's important for you to talk about the work that you have done before. Now, some of this work could be your work. Some of this work could be work that has been done by others, recorded in publications, where it substantiates the claims, the key claims that you are making. So if it is the use of infrared for a certain application, I would like to project publications by others, reputed publications, which talks about how infrared is being used for this purpose. I would also like to talk about some of the work that I have been doing in the lab myself or in my company, to sort of demonstrate these claims in my hands. Some of this that I in my hands I'm able to show, at least at this level, that infrared can be used, and these are the correlations that I have got so far. And the reason this becomes important is it's important for you to define where you stand, what is the scope of the project that you're applying for the grant for, and what is your end goal. So it's possible that the scope of the project over 18 months and maybe with 10 lakhs or 20 lakhs, which is the grant amount that you're pitching for, you will be able to do only this much. But your end goal is a product goal that you have. And I think it's important for a reviewer to see this in context. This is how much has been done. This is what works. This is what doesn't work. This is the scope of what is it that I want to do with this money and this time. And this is the eventual end goal that I'm looking at. So if I have to give you an example, again, going back to the diabetes example that I gave. So the grant goal could be a device that detects blood glucose levels non-invasively within 10 minutes with a limit of detection of so much, with some sensitivity and specificity at lab scale, validation done with, say, spiked samples and 20 patient samples. Now, if you have this clarity, it becomes very easy for you to convince somebody else that this is your grant deliverable. So it's important for you to define this. And if I come back to the first few slides I started with, which is your product development plan, if you were to break down your phase goals and define, say, your goal for phase 2 is to achieve this, then it's very easy for you to work backwards and say that this becomes a deliverable for a grant. But your MVP goal may be something else. You may want to improve your time for detection. You may want to improve your sensitivity, specificity. You may want to do a larger validation in a clinical setting. So this gives a sense to the reviewer that you know where you want to eventually be and how much of this can actually be accomplished with the grant funding that they can give. This is just an example of an agricultural product where you may not be able to define a lot of the metrics numerically, but at least you will be able to define the type of crop that you want to test it on. You may be able to define at what scale and in what type of pests maybe, or organisms that you want to test that crop against, versus what you would want to do at the MVP level. This is what I mean by key claims. I think this is something that I've been saying throughout the talk, but I think it's important for you to know what key claims means. So key claims basically means that these are claims you're making about the technology of product, which if it doesn't hold good, you cannot develop a product based on this. That means in many ways, they are the fundamentals of your product. They form the foundation of what you're trying to develop. If all my eggs are in the basket of using infrared to develop my non-invasive glucose detection device, and if infrared itself, the claim that I'm making that infrared itself is not a viable technology or a means to detect glucose, then my claim of developing a product around this is not something that might hold good. All right. And also it's important at some point these questions will arise as to, is there a precedence for use of a technology or a principle like this? And also, have you proven this in your own hands and in your own settings? So as I said before, when you are making claims, try and provide substantiation for your claims with both data that has been published as well as data that you have generated. All right. It's also important, and many grants ask for this, a backup plan in some case. That means they would like to know whether you have thought of an alternative. Because what is important, I think, from a product perspective is if you have defined an unmet need and you want to solve that need, ideally, then you're not sort of married or attached to any one particular technology. You're willing to develop a product that will solve that need. So they would like to understand whether you've thought of alternate ways or mechanisms to develop a product like that, maybe using different principles or using different technologies in case what you have thought of does not work out, right? Then that also brings me to then talking about milestones. It's very important for you to define how milestones itself for your grant. And again, this becomes very easy if you know what your phase goals are, for the product that you're developing. So it's nice to have milestones defined in a way that both you as well as the person reviewing your milestones understand whether these milestones have indeed been met or not. Like, for example, if the more numeric, the more absolute they are, it becomes very easy for the reviewer as well as for you to say that these milestones have been met. There is very little room there for ambiguity. I do understand that it's not possible to do that all the time, but wherever possible, try and define absolute milestones. And please make sure that your milestones also are in alignment with what your grant deliverable is at the end. While at an early stage grant may not expect you to sort of implement a commercialization strategy, what they want to understand is, have you thought through it? So they want to know what your business model can be, whom are you selling to, what are your, what kind of business models are you looking at? And most importantly, who is your buying customer for a product like this? I've taken BIG as an example, but for any other grant also, right? So if you were to end with that grant, what is it that you're subsequently going to do? So they're also trying to understand whether your product or your project dies down with this grant, or do you really have a plan in place to sort of continue working on this aggressively after the tenure of your grant gets over. So I think at an early stage, it's important to think through this and mention this. If you're applying for a slightly late stage grant meant for product commercialization, then I think they would expect you to have a very thorough understanding of what your commercialization strategy is going to look like. All right. So I think this is just this. I just said this, which is like you need to define your customer. You need to know how you will access your customer, what you will sell, a sort of broad pricing for your product. Be realistic about this because even they know that at this stage you may not be in a sort of a state to define a very accurate price, but they want to know how are you thinking about defining a price. All right. And don't use complicated business model canvases because you may be very early for that. I think you need to do a lot of homework to get to that stage where you can represent that in a very refined and a very finished manner. I think the more real you are about describing this, the chances that it would resonate with the reviewer is also more. Do provide a competitive landscape, even if not asked for. Do make sure that you differentiate on value parameters and not on technology parameters. That means of what is of value to the customer. Try and make it quantitative as much as possible when you differentiate so that, again, there is very little room for ambiguity. Don't use words like less, more, high, low, so that these things are clear. And do remember that when you're putting certain numbers down, you don't have proof for these numbers at this stage. Maybe not all of them, and that's fine. But you do have certain basis for saying that these could be my numbers. And I think at that stage, that should be enough. I think they will understand that these are claims that you are making. Okay. The team plays a very important role. I think if you see the chart that I had shared earlier for at least BIG, there's a lot of weightage given to the team. You may not have a full-fledged team in place when you apply for an early stage grant, but at least try and mention what type of people you will be engaging, your background, your experience in working in this space, and what expertise will you bring to the project itself in this 18-month duration. All right. Market, I think, as I said, again, it depends on the stage at which you're applying for. They just want to know that you have understood this. In some cases, they do expect you to have at least done a small primary market, search to understand in maybe a certain geography or a certain, how do I put this, niche area in your market. Have you at least spoken to 15, 20, 30, 40 customers to understand their pain points, understand what is it that they're interested in, what would serve as a value proposition for them. And it would be nice to do that and also condense those learnings in a way that you can represent to the reviewer as part of the application. So instead of giving, sort of numbers which are not relatable, which are global numbers, etc., which at this stage, if it's very early, may not resonate a lot with your product. It's okay to say that in 1 or 2 lines, but then to give more realistic insights that you have actually spoken to so many customers and these are your insights would be, I think, more valuable. I think this is something that I have found useful to do personally, and also I think I have told startups to do, and they have found it useful, is try and have a master document, which is like a document, a go-to document for you, which is updated regularly. Try and make sure it has at least 5 broad sections: product development, plan, and status, which you will keep updating as you keep developing your product and you have updates. The competition, because this changes also fairly dynamically. Process information and updates. That means all the regulations, certifications behind a product like yours, your market research, your customer interactions, and your financials. I think if you have a document like this, it becomes very easy for you to quickly pull out what you need for a relevant grant application and quickly put one together. Now, it's possible that, you encounter a grant application 3 days 3 days before the deadline. And, the stage that you're at, you want to leverage as many funding opportunities as possible. Having something like this reduces, your anxiety, also reduces your bandwidth, increases your bandwidth, because you don't end up making every application from scratch. You can just quickly go pull out what is needed and put together a grant application. So try and have one master document. And by the way, this also helps you with your pitches for your investors and many, many other things going ahead. and it'll help you pick and choose what is it that you want. So I think that's it from me. So we'll be happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you, Priya, for summarizing this entire domain very well. Let us look if there are any questions here in the chat box. Show the chat box. Yeah, so meanwhile, I have one question. You just referred to this master document, wherein like in 3 days time, you could put in a grant application. But according to you, what would be a good timeline before any grant deadline where they can start building a application as a reference? Yeah.
So as I said, I think see, in some cases, if you're doing it for the first time, you've never applied for a grant before, then you are at the mercy of the application process itself. Like if you come across an application deadline 3 days from now, you don't have a choice. You're putting something together 3 days from now. However, as I said, there are many national grants which do now give about 60 to 90 days. So the earlier you start, the better. It does take a lot of work for you to get to a stage where you yourself may be happy with an application that you're willing to submit. I know of a lot of people who have sort of worked very hard on an application and reached the last day before submitting it and read through it and felt that, this is not something that I want to submit because I'm not happy with what I have put together. And maybe they must have spent maybe a week or two doing it and not given it all because they didn't have the kind of time or the bandwidth to do it. So the earlier, the better. And as I said, don't wait for the announcement of a grant for that to happen. I think just preempt it and start having your material ready so that you can use it for a grant application as and when the opportunity arises.
Priya, there's a question from me. See, the grant goes through different stages of review.
Yeah.
Right. The first stage, very often it's a blind review and you don't get to present your case yourself.
Yeah.
Whereas at a later stage, you get a chance to present yourself, and you have a chance to defend. So do you want to comment on precautions and steps to be taken to address each of these stages? Because in the early stage, you won't be there to defend your proposal, right? So are there some pointers you want to give to the audience about that?
Right. So there are two things to this. One is that there are certain grant applications I've seen which are very restrictive in terms of how you share information. They don't give you an opportunity to share information maybe with graphics, visual representations, etc. A lot of it goes in the form of writing, which means when somebody reviews your application, that is the only content they have to look at. In some cases, you do have the opportunity to upload documents which substantiates what you are also sharing in writing. Now, do remember that when you share something where the person, you are not there to describe the application verbally, it's a thin line between sharing just enough for them to understand very clearly, what is it that they are looking for. So what I mean by this is, see, there may be grants which evaluate you entirely on a technical merit of your proposal, which means you want to share enough technical information for the reviewer to evaluate the technical credibility of your product or your project. There may be certain grants, if you're applying for a product commercialization grant, for example, they may be interested in looking at something else. So there you are looking at sharing a different kind of information. Using one tailor-made sort of application for all grants is, I would suggest, a complete no-go. Avoid doing that where you have one written application and you just sort of submit it to all grants. It doesn't work. So please customize what you are writing or sharing, keeping in mind who is going to review your application at that first stage. So when we used to mentor candidates to apply for BIG, in many cases, we used to call that written application a teaser or a trailer, because you can't share beyond a point. You can only share so much, right? And we've also seen that, and personally having reviewed BIG applications, if the content is so much, a person is not able to describe what they are doing in a crisp and succinct way, it becomes very difficult for the reviewer to even understand what is it that you're pitching for. So this takes some time to get at. That means it takes a lot of iterations for you to write, re-edit, get it vetted by maybe your team members and your advisors, etc. Get it to a point where you're very clear about what you want to convey. Convey what the reviewer wants to read. Again, very, very important. And as far as possible, try and introduce, if they let you submit an application with a diagram or a drawing or a graphic, please push them to go and see that document. In many cases, I've seen that candidates submit nice documents, but they don't refer to that document anywhere during the application. So you read the application and then you realize after reading the whole thing that, oh, they have also submitted these other things, but it was not referred in to the application. So if you refer it in, please do your homework. Make sure that you understand what the grant is for and therefore who will be reviewing the grant, and then share information accordingly.
Yeah, I suppose that includes a concept note kind of a thing, which you refer to during in the summary, saying that there is a concept note out there. That's what you mean, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a question from Hardeep. Many applicants try to fit a large amount of work in short time to match the quantum of grant. How does one balance this? So how much work should you fit in versus, how much do you what is reasonable to fit in?
Okay. So I've seen this go both ways. There have been applications where they've shared so much work where the grant reviewer has said, if you've done all this, why do you need the money? And there have also been cases where they've said that this is not enough or adequate amount of work to substantiate the claims that you're making in this grant. Yeah. So I think it's important for you to share. It's not about how much amount of work you're sharing. It is about what is it that you're sharing. So like, just to give you an example, if going back to the product example that I gave, right? If the basis of my diabetic detection device is that I'm using infrared, but I'm sharing, claims to substantiate that the product looks this way, or the product can be worn this way, or, the product works without electricity. I mean, this doesn't substantiate the key claim that I'm making. While I may be sharing a lot of such information, what I am not sharing is how did I arrive at that claim, which is using infrared to make a device that can detect glucose non-invasively. So it's about sharing the right kind of information in the right manner to say that I'm giving you enough data to substantiate the claim that I'm making. And it's the claim on which the claim is the basis for me to apply for this grant application. So I think more than the amount of work, you have to be mindful about what you want to share.
I think the question is also about the work that's being proposed during the project. In the sense, people trying to do a lot of stuff in that 18-month period or whatever it is during whatever the grant period. And packing it in.
Yes.
So maybe you can comment on that also.
Right. So I'll give you one example, which is easy to give because I've seen a lot of examples in this space, is drug development. Now, if you look at the process of drug development, right, I think we all know that it takes a long time, double-digit years to develop a drug from scratch all the way, say, to market. And again, there's no guarantee that you will have a drug. But if in a process like this, just going from a lab stage where maybe I'm validating my molecules in a lab setting, to say performing clinical trials, this itself is a stretch. Now, a process like this would ideally take a bunch of crores, double digit, sometimes more, higher double digit, and a significant amount of time. But if I pitch this entire thing for a 50 lakh grant application, it is very clear that it is not realistic to achieve that. So I have to be very realistic about what I'm pitching for how much money and how much time. So there have been cases where grants have been rejected because of the fact that a lot of work has been pitched for a short period of time and a short amount of money. At the same time, I think I've also seen the other way, although people are willing to at least give some benefit of doubt. Like, for example, you're asking for, say, 20 lakhs, but the work may actually take 50 lakhs to do. And the reviewer is maybe willing to say that, look, what this person has proposed looks okay, but the amount of money they're asking for looks unrealistic. They may actually need more money to do it. that you may be able to get away with. They may be willing to sort of say that we'll give you another chance to do that. But if you do it the other way around, which is pitch for a lot of work to be done so that it looks good on the application, but then that doesn't sound realistic in terms of money or time, then I think the chances that that would not go through is higher.
Yeah. Before we take the further questions, let me just remind the audience, the feedback link is in the chat box. Please do not leave the session without filling up the feedback link. It's very important for us to get your feedback. Yeah, over to you, Dr. Premnath.
Yeah, no, there is a question about plagiarism and so on. I don't know if you want to, do you want to take that on after submitting the content? Is the plagiarism taken care of? Two ways. One, whether it's plagiarized from somewhere else or it gets plagiarized elsewhere, probably both. We can.
So if you're talking, I mean, when you say plagiarism, are you talking about the actual content that you're writing, or are you talking about from a technology point of view, can somebody read what you have submitted and then develop that product or that technology on their own? The latter, as I said, I think if you are really working on something innovative, the chances that they would read an application and based on that actually be able to develop that product is probably less. And if it is that easy to do, then you may want to rethink what is really novel or innovative about what you're doing. That's one. As I said, I think there are enough ways to describe what you're doing without sharing everything about what you're doing. So you are describing the concept. You're not describing formulations and proportions and amounts and things like that. So you're not going into all those details as much as possible, is my understanding, when you apply for a grant. If it is about text plagiarism, I mean, I don't know. I mean, a lot of it is stuff that you write. In fact, you might be doing a plagiarism check yourself before submitting a grant application. There are many ways to do that now. So I think that I wouldn't worry too much about.
Yeah, and as far as copying is concerned, many of these cases, you'll see that the reviewers are bound by some confidentiality agreement of some kind. And also, we do advise people to file their patents and so on before discussing it. And as Priya said, details are not really, like, you might say what exactly you're going to do, but not necessarily how, right, in detail. Right?
Yeah.
There's a question about validating products. What are the I mean, the question reads as, could you please throw light on where we can validate our product and info regarding that, but probably a broader strategy of how you go about validating it when you write these grants and how you can arrange the validation.
Yeah, so I think, first of all, I think it's very hard. If you're working on a deep tech product, you will not be able to invest in all the resources that you need for validation in-house. A lot of times validation happens through collaborations with institutes, reputed organizations, sometimes validation bodies themselves. So the more the regulated the product is, you will have very standard mechanisms to validate your product. It's actually easier. Although it may be expensive, it is easier. But then in cases where that is not defined, your next bet is institutes, R&D centers or research centers, which are able to do some of that validation for you. And my understanding is there are grants where you can build that into the grant itself. So there are grants that will give you money for validation. So you can always say that I'm going to validate this with an ICAR institute or with an ICMR institute or wherever, and you build the cost of something like that into the product itself.
Yep. I think that's about the questions over here. I just wanted to request you to also comment on if you were a reviewer looking at it the first time, right? What are the top 3 things you'll first look at? I suppose you would want to look at just the idea and its soundness, right? You would probably not focus on all the rest of the details of budget and timelines and all that, right? So do you want to suggest how a typical reviewer might prioritize a given idea? And I think there's one hand up. So after that, Mugdha, maybe you can take that up next. Okay. Yeah.
So at least for me, I would like to see, first of all, how the candidate or the applicant has defined the problem. Now, I understand that it's possible that, at a very early stage, you may not have all the data or the claims to validate your problem, but just your thought process on how you have defined the problem, I think is something that I will look at. I will look at how you have defined your product. That means the clarity with which you are able to communicate what your product is. As in, whether it's visual, you're showing me something, it's important for me in my head to be able to see what that product looks like and to see how a customer will use that product. And when I say that, I don't mean that you have a final product in hand to show that to me, but the fact that you have made the effort to think through that and convey that to me is important. And third thing is, if I'm evaluating something where the technology is the basis for everything, in the sense if the technology idea does not hold up, the product does not, then I would want to understand how you are substantiating claims of your technology. That means, what kind of data are you providing to say that this is the reason I'm going with this technology, whether it's your own data or whether it's published data. Many a times people, if they're sharing published data, they just give, they cut and paste pictures, figures from the paper onto the grant application. It's very difficult for a reviewer to contextualize those figures with your story or your product. So it would be nice if you were to distill all that information and put it down in a certain way to say that, so many papers say that this technique can be used or this method can be used for this purpose. So there are so many products in the market, for example, which have used this before or anything. But if you were able to put that down in an organized way, I think that offers a lot of value. And also your competitive landscape. Have you made the effort to go and understand who else is working in this space and tried to differentiate from them? I think these are things that I would like to see in the application.
I think last question and then we'll close. I think over to you.
Hands which are up. So let me unmute AKC first. I don't know.
It's done. It's done. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, good evening, everyone, and thanks for the nice session. Quickly, I will just come into the question. Usually when we encounter proposals from academic researchers, especially those who are doing a PhD or postdoc sort of thing, so these are mostly idea-driven projects, and the lot of orientation becomes necessary to take them towards applied work.
Yeah.
So what do you consider will be the role, importance of mentorship for developing these projects from the very beginning? Because what we do at our end, we initially ask the applicants just to give a two-liner ideas, and from there we just curate their entire complete concept, thinking, okay, whether it is working here or here. Okay, so step by step we curate their entire project. Of course, that takes a bit longer time. Okay, but then what is the importance of this type of mentorship in your opinion?
So I think mentorship is extremely important. I think what that kind of mentorship provides is, it may not influence your idea, but it will influence how you project that idea. Because as a researcher or an expert maybe in that area, you may be the best judge of what technology can be used to develop a certain product or what will work under what settings. What I mean is the technical information about that product development process or the product itself, you may be the best judge of that. But how to represent that, I think mentorship plays a very important role. That's why incubation centers spend a lot of time handholding startups or entrepreneurs even before they create an entity in trying to help them reorient, say from the mentality of what you would pitch for a research grant to what you would pitch for a grant, say to develop a prototype or a product. So it's a sort of a it's a mindset, it's a shift that you need to make, when you write that grant, and do get help, because I think that help makes a lot of difference.
I think in past, I had to reorient certain project proposals entirely from its product perspective, I mean a technology perspective also.
Yeah.
Okay. Because that researcher, they knew a basic technology.
Yeah.
But then when we found that, okay, what raw material you want to use, that is not feasible. that is not available on a commercial scale. So now you change the entire raw material. Okay. And then the process becomes different. And sometimes we say, okay, no, this route will not reach to that particular endpoint.
Yeah.
And this will not reach to your, like, meet the critical success factors for the market that you are targeting.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you change the entire product orientation and focus on a different market segment. So this thing, actually, we have to do many cases,
Yes. So when I think when this question was asked previously, I only answered this from the point of pitching for a grant. I did not comment on how that kind of mentorship can change your business story. So see, you are no longer working on a research project. I think this kind of mentoring that I spoke of one is, of course, how you pitch for it. The other element is it's highly possible that as you go through that mentoring process, you may have to look at your project itself in a very different light, because now you're looking at a commercial angle to your product. You're looking at, whether you will make money by selling the product, will someone buy it, whether you have an edge. So there are a lot of things that come into play from a story point of view. So yes, I completely understand that it's possible that your product story changes when you are now trying to raise money for it as an entrepreneur and not as a researcher.
Yeah, thanks, Priya. So I think there are no more questions even in the chat box. So let me remind everyone once again that feedback link for Priya's session here is there in the chat box. Please do fill up the link. And our next upcoming session is on Only Finding Licenses by Dr. Vandana Sarda. And this is going to come up on 14th of March at the same time at 4 o'clock. So please join us for this session. With this, let me thank Priya for this wonderful session and summarizing all the points so beautifully, and also giving time for answering all the questions. In case there are any more questions beyond this session, Priya, we would reach out to you over email. So I hope you would be okay with it.
Thank you, Mugdha, and thank you, Dr. Premnath and the Venture Center team for inviting me to do this.
Thanks, Priya.
Thank you so much. Bye.